Welcome to week 5 of Introduction to Neurodiversity. The two books that we're using for this course are my two books on neurodiversity. The first one is The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and that's focused mostly on adult neurodiversity. And my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life. And that book is more applicable to kindergarten through 12th grade education. In Module 5, we're going to examine the gifts of the dyslexic mind. What was learning to read like for you as a child? Is it something that you weren't even aware of, that it just happened all by itself? Did you struggle to learn to read? Was there a stigma connected to that? Or were you a great reader and got extra praise for that? And also, were you aware of others around you who had varying degrees of difficulty learning to read? In this presentation, what I'm going to do, and this is going to be true for all 5 diversities that we're going to discuss in the next 5 weeks, I will use as a framework the positive niche construction model that I presented in our last module. But I have taken off the last 2 components of positive niche construction because they would apply to each of the diversities pretty much equally, whereas the first 7, which are featured in my book Neurodiversity in the Classroom, tend to give birth to different sorts of interventions, different sorts of activities and ideas and materials for each of the components. So we'll begin with strength awareness. What do we know about the strengths that are associated with dyslexia? Well, one of the things that you probably got from your reading is that individuals who are diagnosed with dyslexia often show strengths in spatial intelligence, to use Dr. Gardner's model. In fact, Gardner's model is ideal for understanding how you can be strong in one area, in picture smart, and have such difficulty in another area, word smart. I noticed that a lot of the kids that I worked with as a special education teacher were picture smart kids who had word smart problems, and that's why they were in special ed, also for behavior problems. But these were kids that drew a lot. You could tell they drew doodles in the margins of their worksheets. They had vivid imaginations. They were machine smart. They liked to play with Legos, that kind of thing. They had a mind's eye. We use that term, in the mind's eye, without realizing that there are people who think in pictures and other people who think in words. I did my doctoral dissertation on the strengths of children who were labeled learning disabled using Gardner's model as an organizing framework. And this was one of the documents that I included in my dissertation. This was a picture that the boy who drew it told his mom, this is a kid that has peanuts poured into his brain. They go squirting out his ears. He takes that peanut mixture and mixes it with butter in the tube that he's carrying to make peanut butter, and then he goes from door to door selling it on his skateboard. And I thought this was a pretty good example of the mind's eye at work, because we see a lot of different ideas expressed. Also, a fairly good drawing for a first grade child. So in that area of drawing, and not just drawing, but putting interesting ideas together in a creative way, seemed to be one hallmark of what I saw in my dissertation among kids with that diagnosis. Many of these kids who are picture smart are 3D picture smart. This was another document that I included in my dissertation. A middle school boy drew this picture of a car and how it would look if you were leaning out a 8th-floor building. And it seems as if people with this 3D vision, it's almost like they have a gigantic eyeball that can go around the room at will and look at the world from all these different points of view. One of the studies that we looked at in our reading this week was the impossible figures task, where people taking the test were asked to tell whether or not this object could be built in 3 dimensions in reality or not. And so to decide if it was a possible object or an impossible object. And individuals who are diagnosed with dyslexia did this more quickly than individuals who are diagnosed, who were typically developing rather. Many of these students also show budding entrepreneurial proclivities. This was another reading that we did this week by Julie Logan, who did a study at the Cass Business School at Sydney University in London, where she really looked at and interviewed individuals who were self-entrepreneurs. And she noted the high proportion of individuals with dyslexia who were in entrepreneurial jobs as opposed to those who were in like middle management jobs in large corporations. I think she said 30% of American entrepreneurs identified as having dyslexia, but only 1% of individuals in corporations. And she seemed to indicate that self-entrepreneurs had fewer barriers to implementing their visions. They also had experience overcoming difficulties with their reading, and so they knew how to get around problems. They knew how to delegate authority. That was an interesting one. They also had a big picture outlook, which also is important. We see many examples of entrepreneurs who've gone on to multi-billion-dollar fortunes, like Richard Branson and Charles Schwab and Ted Turner and Paul Orfalea, who founded Kinko's. Finally, another strength that comes through both in the 3D spatial intelligence as well as in the entrepreneurial dimension is the ability to think holistically. Your reading this week indicated that people diagnosed with dyslexia have better peripheral perception as opposed to center field perception, where you have to look at words and sequences one after the other. They're more simultaneous learners. They did better at a task that involves looking at this image or this little indentation in the B square and finding it in the blurry picture of A. They were able to learn how to do this more quickly. They had a sharper learning curve than typically developing college students. So this also suggests the idea of a big picture, holistic learner, learns on the periphery. And I was thinking about this in terms of evolution. And it seemed to me that if you're growing up in the wild, the ability to perceive peripherally is at least as important and maybe more important than the ability to perceive in this detailed, fine-grained way, because you needed to be aware of your environment. You know, things on the side of your vision could well be impinging on your survival. And it's really interesting looking at some of the studies on learning disabilities and dyslexia, how wedded they are to the idea of not being able to read as a central anomaly, a central disorder in the brain, Whereas if you stand back and look at the big picture, if I can do that, you see that reading is only 5,000 years old. Whereas we've been living in the wild for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And so the ability to perceive peripherally probably has a much longer evolutionary history, certainly, than the ability to read. So it's as if the peripheral gifts are the default mode, and the ability to read is a very specialized and recent acquisition. And it's not unreasonable then to understand why some people might have difficulty with it. But seen against this broader context, the disorder seems to lose a lot of its acuteness and immediacy. And the fact that we've put a lot of energy behind dyslexia, a lot of parents advocated for their kids in the 60s and 70s and really brought this to the fore, doesn't mean that we should see this as the center of the world, but in fact that these kids are actually perceiving quite normally for them and quite in tune with the evolution of humanity. Also, these individuals often have mechanical aptitude. They're machine smart. I remember when I was in elementary school, they would give us achievement tests. And some of the tests were math, some of the tests were reading, and some of the tests were mechanical reasoning. And you had to look and say, okay, if X cylinder moves in a clockwise direction, what direction is gear W going to move in? And there are all kinds of problems like that. And the fact of the matter is I totally bombed on mechanical reasoning. While I often was in the 98th percentile in reading and maybe 94th and third in math, I'd be down in the 12th, 13th percentile or even lower in the mechanical reasoning. And the thing is, I'd see kids who weren't doing well in school, who I always thought of as dumb, who would really do well in the mechanical reasoning. And this is kind of my wake-up call, even at this early age, to the fact that there were multiple intelligences, and that being good at one thing doesn't necessarily mean being good at everything. A little bit about positive role models, and we have a wide range of individuals to choose from. I'd mentioned in my earlier lecture last week, Carol Greider, who is a geneticist who won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology for her work in genetics. Another Nobel Prize winner with dyslexia, which I just learned about, is Baruj Benacerraf, who won the 1980 Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology for his work as an immunologist, learning about the mechanisms whereby an immune system can distinguish self from non-self. And I think of this in terms of the three-dimensional mind of the dyslexic. And to be able to understand DNA and the double helix and molecular constructions, you have to have a 3D mind to work effectively. And it may be that they had this 3D mind, which was the trade-off, which is talked about in our reading from Harvard in this week's reading. Another role model would be Phil Schultz, who is dyslexic and won the Pulitzer Prize for his poetry not too long ago. And there are other writers. John Irving would be another example. And you think to yourself, well, how could a writer have dyslexia? Easy. Why should they be able to have necessarily difficulty or ease in reading? It's not the ease in reading or how fast that they read that makes them great. It's their ability to put words together. Maybe it takes them a longer amount of time to put them together, but when they do it better than other people. most other people. Diane Swank is an example, a refreshing example of a woman with dyslexia who is a chief economist, one of the world's most leading economists. It's interesting, she says she's very open about her dyslexia. It's part of who I am. It's made me who I am. If you want strategic thinking, come to me. If you want linear thinking, don't come to me. Here she's referring to that intuition, that big picture thinking, the nonlinear thinking that seems to be a hallmark of many individual entrepreneurs, scientists, and as we said, even writers. Another person with dyslexia is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. I had the honor of actually giving a speech just before he took the podium, and I could tell that he related to what I was saying because I was talking about the dyslexic mind and the strengths. And just in the look in his eye, he was telling me, yeah, I know what that's all about. One of the task performances that I've asked you to do, I've actually given you a choice of 2 this week. One of those is to choose somebody who has succeeded with dyslexia and to examine their life from the point of view of how their dyslexia has helped or hindered, or both helped and hindered their development in their field of choice. And I have a link under that takes you to the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. They have a part of their site dedicated to success stories, where they cover the lives of a wide range of individuals from a broad array of fields. And so you can use that as a resource for doing your task performance for the week. Now a little bit about assistive technologies and universal design for learning tools. First of all, we have computer programs that are dedicated specifically to reading remediation. This is actually from a program called Fast Forward, or Fast Forward. It's, I guess, a kind of a pun. And the idea is kids will learn to discriminate phonemes, among other things, from doing the various tasks that are listed. Phonological awareness being one of the central difficulties associated with dyslexia. The ability to hear subtle differences in verbs, in vowels especially, but also in consonants. Then there are UDL tools like Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a speech-to-text software program, so that an individual who might otherwise have difficulty getting their ideas down on the paper by writing it or typing it can simply talk into the computer and have it create the text. What came through in one of the readings we did this week, or that you're doing this week, is the high levels of oral language that many of these individuals have. They may have difficulty with the printed word, but the spoken word is often a natural strength for them. So using a program like this makes the obstacle that they might otherwise face relatively insignificant. And the reverse of this is also available as a UDL tool in many different varieties, which is text-to-speech software, so that an individual who has difficulty reading text can actually have a synthesized voice translate that text into speech, so they don't necessarily have to read the whole thing, and they can have it read to them. Another important UDL tool is the spell checker and the grammar checker. And I must say, some of you probably will remember that I have suggested that you use your spell checker and grammar checker before you hand your assignments in to me. That would be much appreciated. Another UDL tool that is a little bit unusual is a special typeface called Dyslexic, D-Y-S-L-E-X-I-E, which argues that one of the reasons dyslexics have trouble uh, interpreting the printed word is because of the homogeneous nature of type, which has evolved from, used to be very ornate, each letter having their own unique features, to now a very homogeneous typeface language, which made it harder to discriminate between letters. So this typeface has several different features, including heavier bottoms, different shapes for the different letters, and so forth, to make it easier to read. Another UDL tool that I list here, could be a strength-based learning strategy also, would be pop-up books, which translate into 3D, a two-dimensional book. This is a book on leaves, and you read about leaves, but you also have the three-dimensional experience of leaves. This also reminds me, I didn't put this into this presentation, but it reminds me of augmented reality. I recall with the Guinness Book of World Records, you can train your phone onto the pages of that book and can see a shark coming out of the water, out of the page, literally toward you. And that's another way in which 3D comes into the world of 2D books. I also thought about hypertext, and I'll have more to say about this, I believe, when I get to the issue of ADHD. But hypertext is a very interesting way of interacting with reality. We have an entry point, and we click on something, and it leads us to another page, which leads us to another page. And there's something very holistic and intuitive about this, which allows individuals who think in this broader holistic way to construct meaning from the computer. Instead of just laboriously going one word after the other, trying to make meaning out of a sentence, they're able to construct broader and even peripheral meanings from their research. Then I just wanted to show how one software program, in this case Microsoft Word, can actually give rise to a variety of UDL features. Here I've got some text that I just arbitrarily got off the internet, something about the history of the United States. And so here we have it in one form. We can put it in different colors. Many years ago, there was a lot of controversy about whether or not colored lenses helped kids with dyslexia read more effectively. And I think most of the research said there was no significant difference between having the color or not. But still, it doesn't hurt to try. And the novelty of having different colors may aid in decoding. Or you can make the fonts bigger and easier, less words per line to be able to manage. Or you can put it into a different typeface to make those unique letters that I talked about just a minute or so ago, to get away from the homogeneous text that plagues our books. Or I could double space or even triple space to make it easier to read. Or I could make them the same text. This is the same text that I showed you at the beginning. I could change it into bullet points. Or I could go through it and highlight in yellow or red or blue or any other color key points that I wanted to remember. Or I could translate it into a different language. Or I could split it into syllables. Or, and here's an interesting thing that some people aren't aware of, and that is Microsoft Word has a text-to-speech feature in it. If you go to review and click on read aloud, it will actually read the text that is on the page for you. So that's a very important feature for individuals with dyslexia and individuals who are sight impaired, etc. Now a little bit on strength-based learning strategies. One that I like that is very much moving from picture to word or picture to letter is a strategy from Waldorf education, which is a progressive education philosophy developed by Rudolf Steiner back in the 1920s. And one of the definite advantages of this kind of teaching is that it's very artistic in nature. And Steiner said that kids should have letters, the alphabet, introduced to them through pictures, so that they are told, for example, a story about a snake. And then they form the snake with clay. And then the teacher on the board begins to make the snake look more and more like the letter S. And this is particularly integrative in that not only the shape looks like the snake, but also the sound of S is similar to the sound that some snakes make. And he suggests introducing each letter of the alphabet in this pictorial way. And I suspect that if this was done, there would be fewer kids with diagnoses of dyslexia and learning disabilities. There's another approach that I got from the Davis Dyslexia Correction System, which I don't recommend to people because it's got some half-baked ideas. But I did like this strategy where they had individuals creating the letters and words in 3 dimensions with clay and even illustrated the meanings of the words through clay. And this multi-sensory approach to me was, not an end-all and be-all or a fix-it-all, but it certainly is one strategy that can give kids hands-on experience and represent words in 3 dimensions. And then I think I talked about this in last week's module, the idea of not just giving students writing assignments or reading assignments, but being able to let them illustrate what it is that they write by cartooning, for example. One of the stories I like to tell is about Robert Ripley, who is actually, he actually came from Santa Rosa, California, where we live, or where I'm living. I'm about 35 miles from Santa Rosa. And Robert Ripley, of course, became famous for his Ripley's Believe It or Not. I mean, now we have the museums, but back in his day, he had a newspaper column that went out to just millions of people worldwide, where he, albeit he wasn't necessarily politically correct, but he showed a lot of interesting images representing cultural diversity. And when he was in high school, his teacher let him turn in pictures and cartoons instead of written assignments. And I point to this because, people will say, well, how's he going to find a job drawing pictures? And he did find a job. He was actually one of the richest persons in the world when he was at his prime. Now a little bit about enhanced human resource networks. We remember that kids exist in the midst of complex social networks, and you can illustrate this through what is called a sociogram, and that's what we have an example of here, where we show significant people in an individual's life. And so for the student diagnosed with dyslexia, it may be that the learning specialist is a particularly important relationship that they have in their social network. A very positive, supportive, hopefully encouraging relationship. There may be an older student who can read to that student, or that student can read to a younger student and thus not feel so incapacitated by reading difficulties. When he's the teacher, then he has to be, in the spotlight and perform at his highest. And kids will often do very well, do a lot better reading to other kids than they do reading to adults. And I think I mentioned this in the last module, that if sometimes there's a grandparent who has time on their hands who can actually read with their kids. The Yale Center on Creativity and Dyslexia did a study on these success stories with dyslexia, and they found that each of them had someone in their life who filled them full of a love of reading. And that's something that a grandparent can do, or a parent, or a relative outside of school, and make a big impact. Affirmative career aspirations. This is a very interesting one because it seems to me that dyslexia is more in tune, or the strengths associated with dyslexia are more in tune with the kind of careers that have become available only in the last 20 or 30 years. Well, mechanics goes back further than that. So does architecture, but those are two fields that certainly would be tailor-made to a 3D picture smart individual. And all the visual information that's available to us online has to be supplied, or through movies, videos, websites, and so forth, has to be supplied by picture smart individuals, animators, web designers, and so forth. And surgeons have to have that three-dimensional mind to be able to go in there and understand that it's not a textbook anymore. It's a 3D, an incredibly complex organ. I assume that this is the brain that they're operating on. Then, if you recall our reading, and also what I said earlier in this PowerPoint about that peripheral vision, that diffuse ability to perceive, as opposed to being able to look at central field objects, meticulous detail in that little kind of circle in front of you. That kind of ability, this peripheral, diffuse, holistic perception ability, could be important for microbiology, to look at, all the various elements going on in cells. It could be important in cosmology, looking at the big picture literally. It could be very important in radiology, where you're looking at, this diffused information, and little subtle things often are very critically important to life and death. Finally, a little bit about positive environmental modifications. We looked at the importance of entrepreneurial proclivities in the life of a child or an adult diagnosed with dyslexia. There's a system of education called microsociety that you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a very interesting approach that, a few score of schools around the country, maybe 100 or more, have implemented. And what they do is they spend the mornings involved in traditional academic study, but in the afternoon, they participate in a virtual society. They create their own banks, their own city hall government, their own judicial system, their own stores, so that they are selling things. And for kids that have that entrepreneurial knack, this would be an ideal environment for them to be in. Also, making our reading environments more friendly, less arduous, expecting the kids to read in these straight back chairs at desks that are confining could be seen as an impediment, adding an impediment to already some difficulties that the child faces. So making this reading area comfortable, maybe even putting cushions in, letting kids lie on the floor. There used to be this reading program called Modern Reading. It was back in the late 50s or early 60s that I read about from a guy named George von Hilsheimer. And he was kind of a maverick educator, to put it mildly. But I read about this reading program from him, and it was a program where kids read comic books instead of books. They had pillows and they laid on their floor, and the idea was to have these fast-paced reading sessions accompanied by bubble gum. And they would read for 2 minutes and then break, and then read again for 4 or 5 minutes and break. And apparently this is a very successful program. I'm not surprised that it hasn't been implemented in other areas because I think it goes against the grain of a lot of propriety in so many schools around our country. And then having a space in the classroom for the picture smart individual, having an art center, maybe not just with painting, but also with blocks, with Legos, with machines, with putting it together and taking apart machines and three-dimensional objects of different kinds. And then lastly, I just want you to visualize what, for you, positive niche construction would look like for a person diagnosed with dyslexia. Maybe somebody that you're working with now or that you've worked with in the past, or maybe just someone you imagine working with. Just take your moment to close your eyes and visualize how you'd like to create a positive niche for that individual. And thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Module 6. For further information, get my 2 books on neurodiversity. First of all, The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life.